So before I start, in Australia, it's customary to begin meetings and presentations with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we live and work. It always reminds me of my First Nations family members, friends and colleagues, and leads me to a deeper connection with the country I stand upon. My home is all the way around the other side of the world on Dalrymple country in central Queensland, Australia, right on the border of Wapabara lands. I first learned about spirituality walking alone in the Australian bush, and I first learned about holding ground, being an outsider working to influence change in First Nations-led organisations. So I'm importing that custom, at least for today, and would very much like to pay my respects to the First Nations people whose lands we meet upon. My very limited understanding, and please forgive me if I get something wrong, I'm happy to be corrected, is that there are 7 federally recognised tribes within Virginia, and the area around Norfolk is recognised as Nansemond Nation tribal lands. I promise. My pledge, I promise to walk softly on these lands with respect for First Nations elders past, present, and those still emerging, with respect for all First Nations people, their ancestors, and the spirits of this beautiful country. I would also like to acknowledge everyone here today with significant lived and living experience and the peer frontiers who came before us, paving the roads upon which we now walk. I'd like to pay particular respect to a dear friend, the late, great Anthony Stratford, who held many roles internationally, including expert advisor to the World Health Organization and former board director of N.A.P.S. Anthony was a beautiful human being, a pioneer in peer research, and forged bridges between our countries. I work and speak from my personal lived and living experience of mental health, alcohol and other drugs, homelessness, suicide, domestic, family, and other forms of violence, trauma, an acquired brain injury, and physical disability, including deafness. I will use the terms lived experience and peer interchangeably this morning. In Australia, lived experience is a common term that encompasses people working in peer support roles, but also designated roles in systemic advocacy, consulting, training and education, research, all levels of management, right up to executive level positions. It's not always people's preferred term, but I am going to use it because it encompasses every type of designated job role, which is what I'm going to speak about today. It's also easy to grasp, it explains itself, and because of a point I will reveal later, there's your cliffhanger. But for now, a vision statement that was shared as part of a multidisciplinary funding application, including lived experience leaders and allies from other professions who, unusually, truly did privilege peer perspectives and were committed to a radical vision. Indulge me for a moment. Close your eyes. Picture this. You walk into a recovery service, and from your first impressions of the physical environment, the way you are greeted, the interactions you have with staff, it's obvious every person working in this organisation is committed to finding ways to work with you to improve your emotional, spiritual, and psychological life. This is obvious in the tone of people's voice, in the language and the phrasing they use, in the way your whole self is considered and respected, and how that inspires you to feel like you matter. And instead of feeling lost, frustrated, or terrified, a tiny little kernel of hope alights within you, because here are people who get it, who are going to ally with you, partner with you, respect your knowledge of yourself and be guided by that, who are going to contribute to your confidence and walk with you on a journey that is shared. You can open your eyes now. So what has happened in this multidisciplinary organisation to create such a positive first impression? The short answer is the embedding of peer perspectives, values, and principles from concept development through design, delivery, and evaluation. It is creating from the ground up an organisation that truly understands and aligns with the person walking through the door. And that is achieved by robust, proactive, lived experience workforce development and willingness to share power with peers at all levels of authority in order to co-produce something transformationally different that can facilitate the type of best practice outcomes that keep us all working in this space. I find that persuasive. I've had the honour and privilege of working in a vast range of peer job types and settings and been able to devote many years now to understanding and advocating for our combined workforces. I've seen enormous shifts. Today, I want to share some of what I've observed, as well as what the research tells us about the remaining barriers to full equity for peers within the system. I'll also share what I see as key strategies to further enable a full seat at the tables of decision-making for peers. I'm going to preface this talk by saying much of my public messaging over the last decade and a half has focused on how we move forward most effectively with allies, people from other discipline backgrounds, non-peers. I've spent a lot of time gently challenging folks in other professions by myth-busting some of the misconceptions about our workforce and being firm, but generally as positive as possible in that messaging. I've chosen that focus because, as I'm sure you know, we catch more flies with honey, and berating people rarely wins hearts and minds. I also believe, and the research shows us, that there are great benefits, including benefits to our colleagues in other professions, in peer perspectives being more embedded and honoured throughout the system. When peers rise, we all win. However, I have also experienced a great deal of private disappointment and disillusionment over these years. And sometimes, with a group of like-minded folk, with my mob, I also believe it's important to acknowledge the enormous challenges we still face and to speak plainly. If you've noticed, the balance of power is still overwhelmingly not including our priorities and perspectives. Wave your arms in the air. All the way back in 1997, last century, I got my first proper job working at a First Nations-led and run youth service. I hadn't heard of peer work back then. I lived in a regional area, 400 miles from a major city and about 40 years from the latest trends. I didn't have any qualifications, but I was and I am the eldest of nearly 30 cousins, and I learned to look after little people when I was just a small person myself. So they gave me a job. I didn't know what peer work was, but it made sense for me to connect with the kids as meaningfully as I could, so I drew from common experience. Over the years, I would work many times with young people, particularly young folks described back then as at risk. I knew exactly what they were at risk of. I'd been there too. So when it seemed appropriate, I shared stories from my life that I suspected would resonate with them, and unsurprisingly, built rapid rapport and trust. When I was finally introduced to the idea of peer work, that became my immediate vocation. Nothing in my life had ever made as much sense, and I was compelled to find a way to contribute. I finally talked the local state-run health and hospital service into creating the first paid peer role for my district in 2005. It was not an easy gig. To say there was resistance would be an understatement. Over the years, I worked in many different types of peer roles, trained in intentional peer support, and later moved into my first lived experience academic position in 2009. I'm now nearing the end of my second research fellowship, and recently I've started consulting with motivated organisations to assist them to implement our evidence-based strategies to build peer workforces that are well understood, accepted, respected, and prioritised. Thank you. There have undeniably been huge gains across the decades. I was recently on the interview panel for an executive lived experience role at one of Australia's largest not-for-profit mental health organisations. I also helped inform that position description and design the interview questions to ensure that person had strong roots in our collective grassroots thinking and an emphasis on human rights, social justice, and systems change. It was very gratifying. We have seen an enormous upsurge internationally in the number of peers employed and a growing trickle of peers in more senior role that allow us a greater authority and influence within organisations and the sector. Earlier this year, the Australian federal government announced $7.5 million to establish and operate 2 independent national mental health lived experience peak bodies. One, to represent those of us with first-hand personal experience, and others for folks who have an experience of supporting or walking beside those of us who find our lives disrupted by stress and distress. Great. As long as the people they bring on to those peak bodies understand the principles and the practices of our community, and they don't favour an easy option, either peers who won't prove too challenging and/or those who do not have sufficient experience in peer roles and grounding in the collective thinking that informs our work. Based on a trend many of us have no doubt observed, we shall see. Through those years, I, like most of us, have faced seemingly insurmountable barriers at times, largely attitudinal, and been ground down by the constant need to fight to maintain the same small slivers of ground. I applaud every one of us here today and those who aren't, who choose to stay and work towards service and social change despite how emotionally challenging it can be to act as a change agent. Raise your hand if you have faced discrimination and discrediting, having to constantly re-explain and justify our value, often to the same people, time and time again. We are still frequently excluded from decisions and barred from real influence. I'm not making these claims simply from my own experience and that of others I know, although that is, of course, a valid and valuable form of knowledge. Nearly a decade ago now, the primary finding of my PhD thesis was that, regardless of setting, service type, role, or level of authority, prejudicial attitudes, stigma, and discrimination towards us, as a workforce was so prevalent, many of us no longer even saw it. It was and is just part of the job for many of us. Another key theme of the thesis was sacrifice. During analysis, I remember curling up in a ball, crying, weeping, under my desk after hours of reading participants describe having no social life, no romantic partner, limited ability to engage in hobbies or even see family, inability to work full-time with all the financial implications that brings. All of this because the work was so draining. It took so much. They were describing my life, but I didn't see it until others shared their stories. I expect this may also be familiar to plenty of people here today. It is clearly and unquestionably unreasonable and unlawful for any job to include regular discrimination, inherent prejudice. It is also far beyond the emotional demands of most employment for people to be routinely unable to participate meaningfully in their own life because of their job role. The impacts on us, particularly those of us who've been around a long time or are advocating and working within multidisciplinary environments, are often excessive. No one in their employment should face ingrained discrimination and constant discrediting. And yet we do. I say all of this as a white woman who ended up in a heterosexual relationship. Hey, Sean, my husband's down there. And I have physical disabilities, but they're largely invisible, which of course means that the ways I am systemically silenced, discredited, and kept from positions of influence is significantly less than many others who represent our community, as well as often marginalized cultures, backgrounds, and identifications. In other words, I clearly have it much easier than many of my colleagues who stand for intersectional issues and perspectives. I've been asked socially many times over the years, what do you do for a living? When I explain it to people outside the service system, in about 30 to 60 seconds, a light bulb comes on. Oh, what a great idea, they say. Of course, it should be like that. Why haven't I heard about this sooner? Etc. It takes no time or effort for the average person to understand that someone who has walked these journeys is by far the most knowledgeable about that type of journey and can provide, given the right employment conditions, by far the most relevant support. And yet, here we are. After decades of international advocacy, thinking, training, breakthroughs, expansion of our workforce, and still, somehow, the mainstream service system largely fails to understand our fundamental value and the roles we can potentially play. How is that not willful ignorance? Personally, I never again want to hear the phrase, peer work has an emerging evidence base. For a start, we have tons of evidence, and that argument has been outdated for years. It is literally my job to know this. Secondly, talk to any person who has been impacted by the truth of someone else's story, of having someone walk beside them who really understood the struggles they were facing. There's your evidence. It's prevarication what we're facing now. This resistance. It's stalling, it's denial, it is willful ignorance. Again, I say this as someone who has walked within the system and worked within the system for a long time and tried hard to rationalize and convince others. I say this as someone who has used the processes that prop up the status quo to advocate for our community, our key messages. I say this as somebody who understood that being Dr. Louise Byrne was going to give me a lot more credence than just being Louise. I say this as someone who on the surface has had a number of big wins and you might imagine could be feeling pretty satisfied with the impact of my work. What I see is that we can follow the established processes, translate our lived and living knowledge into the empirical evidence base required for credibility. We can create policies, even at a national level, and have those policies signed off by all levels of government, as we did recently in Australia for the National Lived Experience Peer Workforce Development Guidelines, which is described by government as a key action of mental health reform. And then, the majority of the system is more than capable of ignoring the key messages and continuing to undervalue, exclude, and minimize our contribution. So these days, I say to funders and policymakers, do not talk to me about co-production. Lived experience leadership is what we need. We can't have co-production when our power roles are still so completely unequal. How can you co-produce with someone or with a community that you frequently undermine, coerce, and try to discredit? How can we co-produce when we're not trusted to have knowledge to contribute meaningfully? We collectively have advocated with our whole hearts and minds. We have humbled ourselves, held out our hats, bitten our tongues, and said far less than we mean. We have taken whatever scraps they would give us from the tables of influence, and we have made of it the best we can. Then, and I'm hearing this a lot lately, they tell us, peers are getting too much power. Too much power. Because there is a fraction of funding now attributed to our workforce, even though the guidelines of that funding often prohibits us from doing our work properly and gets in the way of the best benefits we have to offer. Because we finally have a voice at the big table, however emergent, that's considered too much power. Because the system, and I'm not pointing at individuals today or even necessarily individual organisations. I've had the privilege now of consulting with some organisations that have truly embraced and invested in multi-layered strategies emerging from our evidence base to genuinely position lived experience at the centre of everything they do. Good work. The path to that investment can be windy, but we're all learning and growing, and change is challenging. So while there are, of course, individuals and organisations who perpetuate the attitudes and behaviours that create barriers to our most meaningful contribution, I'm talking today not about those individuals, but about the powers that be, setting the agenda, allocating the dollars, driving conventional behaviour and decision-making. The hive mind many people employed to uphold the system often share, particularly when what we are suggesting seems too risky. What I think of as a type of illogical mob mentality, an inability to trust our wisdom, simply because it's different. And that persists due to a lack of investment in systemic education and re-education about the value and necessity of our workforce and the unique knowledge we bring. For the last 9 years, I've worked a lot in conjunction with various government agencies and mental health commissions, major funders, and it has repeatedly broken my spirit and injured my faith in the possibility of real change. I see the final frontier for us is to infiltrate that level of the system, and it will not be easy. There are several key barriers I see for us at that level. The continuation of the existing power base is a primary driver of centralised systems in general. I'd go so far as to claim the system broadly has no intention of sharing power with us, regardless of what we are being told. As you're probably aware, Goffman's theories around stigma, particularly perceived stigma, centre around the idea of social deviancy. This, of course, is at odds with the desire for systems to have predictability and control. Hoffman describes the situation of the individual who is disqualified from full social acceptance. He's describing people like you and me, who in the eyes of the status quo are fundamentally less credible and our views undesirable. It is the business of the system to ensure our deviant ideas do not gain too much credibility or influence. Peers can't have too much power. This underpins what I consider our next biggest obstacle, risk aversion. We all know that, right? What we define as necessary growth is often labelled as risk by the system, and the system is terrified of risk, regardless of the potential rewards. In intentional peer support, I remember learning that when our processes and reactions are informed by fear, everything we do is tainted by that fear. And of course, if, for example, you don't let a little toddler practice walking in the lounge room because you're afraid they're going to fall and hit their head, you end up with one mighty passive and incapable toddler. You inhibit their natural growth and the building of necessary ability to function independently. There are parallels. Additionally, the type of thinking, the types of brains that are successful in our outdated education system and are then attracted to working in organisations that hold power often think, perceive and behave very differently than we do collectively as a community. Even when there is the desire to engage meaningfully with us, with few exceptions, understanding of how different our views and approach is from current practice falls short. The power of the existing system is so prevalent and privilege is so ingrained. The way the system engages with us is damaging to us. And any changes we can make are still falling dramatically short of our collective goals and the logical need within our communities for human-centered, heart-based services that build connection and contribute to hope. There is essentially no accountability for policymakers and funders at this point, and instead an almost worshipful and often illogical prioritizing of convoluted existing processes that leads to massive procrastination on the part of funders, leaves ridiculously short timeframes for us to respond to funding bids and then, if successful, to be able to complete projects. All of this against a backdrop of us already being stretched to the limit, but feeling unable to let opportunities go by, even for the sake of our well-being, because if peers don't lead it, it will go to someone who distorts our concepts and misses the point. All this said, I still believe we as a community, as a philosophy, and as a new way of thinking can transform what's possible. I've stayed in this work through 12 years of burnout because I couldn't imagine spending my time and energy on anything else. I've been driven. It's a fire that's almost burnt me up over and over again. It's a need to contribute that has significantly impacted my health, relationships, my quality of life, and like many of the other addictions I've faced, I can't stay away, I can't stop. Probably people in the audience who know what I'm saying. Yeah. Because the need is too great. And I know, and we know all too well, what it is to have your life destroyed by a system that is meant to help. To have your concept of self distorted by the beliefs of a system that frequently and fundamentally misunderstands and misinterprets the needs of vulnerable human beings. I have stayed, we have stayed, I have fought, we have fought, because I believe in us. We are us. What needs to shift, in my opinion, is what counts as valid evidence, what is considered valuable knowledge, and how to apply that knowledge in practice. For millennia, formal, more traditionally masculine forms of knowledge have been increasingly promoted, to the point where nearly all advanced education now happens in the hallowed halls of the academy, regardless of how effective or otherwise that education may be. It is a widely accepted truism these days that many degrees are not worth the paper they're printed on. And yet, it is this formalised knowledge that still dominates. What we bring is a different kind of knowing, an emotionally earned and built experiential knowledge, a school of hard knocks knowledge, a more traditionally feminine and therefore historically less valued form of knowledge. It is a common sense, practical and grounded knowing that allows us to see what other forms of knowledge miss and to do what other professions are less able to do. Bridge that gap and be with someone in their distress, their confusion, their trauma. I'm the first person to acknowledge there's no such thing as concrete reality. Even day to day, I can see my perspective of the same situation shifting, changing. As a person and as a researcher, I don't prescribe to the idea of objective truth or one set reality. But my truth, and the truth of many others within our community, is that the system is broken, and it will remain so, unless and until we have the leadership that is logical and allows us to create something radically different and new, which responds to the real needs of actual human beings within our communities, and that can only happen when our knowledge base is respected and accepted as necessary. So how do we get there? Well, I am one person, so I do not have all the answers. Others will provide many strategies and ideas I've never considered. I recently saw on the N.A.P.S LinkedIn page the campaign for the Peer Support Act to, amongst other things, have peer specialists recognised as a distinct occupation. Exactly, that's part of it. Despite all the disappointments over the years, I still believe in us, collectively. And yes, I know we're not homogenous, we have different views, we have multiple perspectives, we have competition amongst ourselves, disagreement. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have parallel violence. I'm not immune. But each of us contribute to a practical, real-world understanding of what service use or inability to access services feels like and what is really needed. Even if, at times, we push against each other, and we do, at least the views we are variously representing authentically come from our lived and living experiential knowledge. Anyone here seen the Monty Python film, Life of Brian? It's an old one. Yeah, we have some hands up. Now, you're probably going to know where I'm going with this. For those who don't, in the film, there are two rebel groups, and they're opposing Roman occupation, okay? So we've got the Judean People's Front over here, and then we've got the People's Front of Judea. They are both very small, and as you may have guessed from their names, have fairly similar views. And yet, they spend more time opposing each other than they do the Roman occupiers. In a poignant scene from the movie, one group member is trying to argue for unified front. This is a British film, I'm Australian, so I'm going to do my best with the accents, but be gentle with me, please. Okay. We mustn't fight each other. Surely we should be united against the common enemy. The Judean People's Front. No, the Romans. Oh, yeah, he's right. We can argue afterwards. We can, and we will, continue to disagree. It's part of the health of this movement, to think critically and constantly evolve. But we can also have shared vision, at least on some points. And if we seek opportunities to publicly agree, to present a united front and argue those common points, we move towards critical mass. For wide-scale acceptance of our lived expertise as a valued form of knowledge, we need our collective influence. I believe one way to enhance this is being recognised more broadly as our own discipline, with our own unique values, principles and practices better understood by the wider system. To promote our knowledge base and increase respect and acceptance for what we uniquely bring, we need discrete spaces that we can come to explore, define, test and refine our understandings of what we do and what informs us, without influence or interference from other, more dominant professions. We need the time and opportunity to articulate our value, our existing and our potential contributions in ways that make sense to us and reflects the principles and practices we uphold. It is our combined and increasingly sophisticated understanding of our discipline that still provides me with hope and belief for change. When we can and do come together to devote time and resources to the promotion of our knowledge base as we are here today, we find ways to unlock doors that have been closed to us. So, I recommend advocating for large and small opportunities to do this as a matter of great priority. We need peers within organisations to have time to yarn with each other. We also need formal research centres that allow us to leverage the processes of the existing system and establish our type of knowledge as credible in the eyes of the establishment without sacrificing our independence or our uniqueness. By extension, I believe if we are more insistent and consistent in both clarifying our knowledge base and pushing against established beliefs about what is valuable knowledge, it will be another small part of moving towards systems change. Regardless of the remaining barriers, we've survived this long with longer odds, less allies, and no power or influence whatsoever. So I think it's pretty safe to say we're not going away. We won't fade into the background. We will still be here collectively to continue to push the system for what is actually needed. Total re-envisaging of the very concepts of mental health, addiction, support, help, and a complete reversal in where power currently resides, who is considered expert, and whose voice is being heard. We who have already persevered through so much will continue to push for what we know is really needed, a paradigm shift, a revolution. If you feel inclined, I'd love you to raise your voices with me now. Start with a bang. Talking about a revolution.